So yes, thanks. I'm Alexis, and I'm here in the Deep Hearing Lab working on speech perception for my postdoc, but this topic was part of my PhD work. So before I get started talking about the methods of human respiration, I'd like to first situate breathing as an example of human behavior, because I think we tend to think of it as this sort of ongoing process that may be a source of noise if you're interested in, for example, the bold signal. So humans are quite unique among primates in that we have exquisitely precise, fast, and flexible control over our intercostal muscles. So your intercostal muscles are the muscles that we use to control our breathing, our chest muscles. And as recently in our evolutionary history as just over 1 million years ago, in our ancestor Homo erectus, you can actually look in the fossil record and you can tell that the innervation required to control our breathing in this way was not present. However, at some point between then and now, the thoracic vertebral canal expanded, and this allowed enhanced innervation, which is how we're able to do things with our breathing, such as produce speech. One interesting side note is that this also happened for Neanderthals, so maybe they were talking as well. But beyond speech, there are other complex human behaviors that we need, or that we use, that we focus on our breathing to engage in. So, for example, it's been known for hundreds or thousands of years across different martial arts traditions that the precision, the timing, and the power of your blow may vary as a function of the respiratory cycle. And there are other groups, for example, dancers and musicians will often work quite hard on coordinating their breathing to enhance their phrasing and temporal coordination. And in the military context, sniper training will actually also focus on the breath cycle. And I want to stress that this isn't just for the purposes of motor stability. It also has to do with this perception that your accuracy or your precision will vary as a function of your respiration. So from the scientific side of things, psychologists have been measuring breathing in behavioral experiments for more than 100 years by now. So for example, this is a chemograph, and essentially the subject would be wearing a stretchy belt that expands and contracts as they breathe in, and the movement in this belt will register as a linear trace on this rotating drum. And at the time, psychologists were interested, for example, in how breathing changed as in response to different mental feats. But throughout the 20th century, we see various approaches that include looking at sensory processing at different points in the respiratory cycle, the ability to detect subthreshold stimuli, for example. And more recently, this team showed that reaction times vary as a function of the breathing cycle, even in tasks we probably wouldn't associate with breathing. They found that subjects tended to entrain their breathing cycle with stimuli presentation. So from the brain side of things, I think when we think about breathing, as I mentioned, it can be thought of as something that kind of seems to do its thing in the background. It's obligatory and it's important for being alive. But one really interesting thing, in my opinion, about breathing is that we also can take over the reins and use our volitional, very fine motor control to control it as well. So the few studies that have looked at volitional control of our breathing find the locus of activity tends to be what you would expect for any sort of fine motor control. And in particular, the supplementary motor area seems to be quite important for this. So we can see these different top-down effects. There's the automatic process that goes on beyond the realm of consciousness, and then this active process. But recently, work in animal modeling has shown that you can actually causally change rhythmic neural cortical activity by externally manipulating the breathing cycle. And this has been shown both in anesthetized and awake and behaving rodents that you can actually change cortical oscillatory patterns by literally manipulating the airflow. So although it's a little bit different in the case of human neuroscience, I think that this line of research opens some exciting possibilities for bidirectionality, and the story is a little bit more complex than this kind of idea that, well, perhaps your breathing cycle is just changing to reflect different mental states, for example. So there are different ways that we can measure breathing. There's the chymograph approach that I mentioned, that's quite old. But today, the most accessible, cheap, and easy-to-use version is actually pretty much the same thing. So rather than registering a linear trace on a rotating drum, we now use some kind of analog to digital conversion. I think many EEG kits will also accept, as long as it has like a BNC connection, I guess, it can take one of these breath belts. So if you want to calibrate or collate between your different signals in an EEG setup, it shouldn't be too difficult to incorporate the breath belt. Now, the thing about breath belts is that they're indirect. So you are measuring torso displacement. In the case of much more accurate spirometry, you would want something like a nasal pneumotachometer, but you can see probably from this picture, it's not the most comfortable thing to use. The most extreme version and the most accurate version is where your subject is literally sitting in a sealed chamber and you know exactly how much air is going in and out of their body. But for most cognitive neuroscientists, I would say this is overkill and probably not going to be compatible with your experiments. Now, while we're here, I want to take, again, another brief historical side note just to mention that much of this early technology was developed by a man named Samuel Cartwright. And he was a physician and a slave owner in the 19th century in the American South. And he actually developed the early spirometer to further his pseudoscientific pro-slavery agenda. So it's obviously a very dark history in spirometry, but I think it's important to mention this because reportedly many textbooks to this day still contain references to race-based differences in lung capacity, which is not true. But to continue, today I'm going to talk about breath belts because, as I mentioned, they are the most accessible and probably compatible to use in your ongoing experimental setups. So the thing that is a challenge with these is getting a good signal. There are many issues and pitfalls that I experienced in my PhD with the belt fitting process. So for example, ill-fitting clothing. If possible, it's a good idea to get your participants to wear layers and to wear a slim-fitting t-shirt or similar, especially if they're wearing bulky jumpers or a sweatshirt, because this can really mess with the signal. You need a fairly good tight fit to make these things work. Another thing is that because the way that these belts work is essentially they just have a couple of magnets that are pulled apart from each other and pushed back together to reflect your breathing movements. So if you have metallic objects such as buttons or a dangly necklace or something like that, that can also just completely swamp your signal. And then another thing I want to mention is individual differences. I think I probably measured about 60 people in my PhD, 60 different people with breath belts. And it is shocking how differently everybody breathes. So for example, in terms of your belt placement, I found that some people breathed more with their lower abdomen. Some people were much more chest breathers. With other people, you got the best results if you actually combine the two belts. So you might need to consider using more than one belt, and you might also need to actually go through and visually assess whether a person's breathing patterns it might be better just to sort of disregard the noisy data and choose one out of the two belts, etc. And then finally, these belts are also quite prone to motion artifacts, so I can also join in the motion or the artifact removal conversation. They are quite vulnerable to movement, and so if your experiment contains button presses or something like this, you would want to think about how you can try to alleviate the possibility of motion artifacts. I was working with speech data, and most people gesture when they speak, so this was something that I got around by asking people to literally hold a piece of cardboard in their hands as they were performing the speaking task to kind of keep their hands from moving around too much. So once you've got your data, and it's hopefully fairly clean, there are various ways that you can pre-process and annotate it. So this is an example of a respiratory trace that is produced from sort of resting state breathing. So the person isn't speaking or behaving or responding with like overt body movements here. And it's like a pretty nice clean signal. It's sort of like a nice sinusoid, what you would expect to see from breathing. And there are different ways that you can deal with this signal. So you could just go through and manually annotate it, which some people do. You can do something like take the zero crossing of the acceleration of the respiratory signal. So for example, the rate of change. So when the breath belt shoots up, that's showing you when the person is breathing in. And then when it's coming down more gradually, that's when they're breathing out. you can do something like bin the signal, basically, or you can look for these kind of landmarks in the profile of the signal. So, for example, these are all, I should mention, these are all approaches that have been reported in the literature. You could take the peaks, for example, and assume that that is the terminus or the ending of the inhalation point. Now, this works great if you're using this kind of nice, clean, resting state breathing. But I was working with speech data, and as you can see, the signal looks quite different. So basically, participants breathe in, and that is that sharp, smooth, rapid acceleration. And then you get this very asymmetric and very idiosyncratic sawtooth kind of pattern as they slowly exhale, which is their speech production happening. And I tried these different approaches that were reported in the literature in my PhD and found that they were they just did not work for me, especially because I was interested in temporal precision. So I'm just going to give a few examples. The blue signal is showing the breath belt, and the kind of orange bumps is basically representing the speech signal. So in this person's case, you can see that there are these 3 peaks. 2 of them, if I corroborate it with the speech signal, they do appear to be true inhalation events. But the one in the middle, although it's a similar shape, it seems to be a motion artifact. In this situation, the person was just a much slower, more gradual breather. So when they were speaking, it was a little bit more difficult to automatically detect the beginning and ending of inhalation events. In this person's case, their breath belt would start, it's kind of hard to make out, I'm not sure if you can really see. Not really. But basically, in the 3rd example, the breath belt has started to rise up before they've actually begun to breathe in. And in this situation, the person's breath belt peaks after they have already initiated speech. So if I were to use one of these simple peak finding approaches, that would be it would be too inaccurate for my purposes. So part of my PhD work was I developed an algorithm that rather than taking global statistics or binning or thresholding approaches, it was a sort of slope analysis approach where I don't think I have time to go into the steps in too much detail, but I'd be happy to explain. But essentially, I also tried to build in what I had learned from corroborating between many, many examples of people's breath belts and the acoustic speech spectrogram. And by comparing between the two, I was able to determine what does a real sort of typical speech inhalation look like. And I found in my PhD and with subsequent collaboration with linguists who also provided independent manual annotations that the results I got were pretty good. So what can you do with this kind of data? So using my automatic annotation technique in my PhD, I did things like compare speech breathing across different speaking styles because I was interested in speech motor planning and I was interested in this relationship between how much you breathe and how much you're planning to say. So in this plot, for the purposes of now, assume that the x-axis is basically showing you roughly how much the person is going to say, how big their utterance is. And the y-axis is showing roughly how big their breath was. And it's been argued that people tend to breathe proportionate to the amount or the length of the phrase they're about to utter. And what I did was comparing across different speaking styles, which are shown in the colors here. I found that in comparison to automatic speech, which is the red, and various forms of text reading, which are the blue and green lines, there was a much weaker linear relationship between breath size and utterance size for spontaneous speech. So this is when people were speaking on the fly. But to show you some examples of what more recently what neuroscientists have been doing with the breathing cycle. So for example, this is looking at heartbeat evoked potentials and also behavioral accuracy in an interoceptive awareness of one's own heartbeat. These authors found that both the neural and the behavioral data vary as a function of the breathing cycle. And then some ECOG, to reference back to Saskia's talk. This was shown in some patients who are undergoing surgical monitoring, and they were looking at the relationship between the respiratory phase and power in these different brain areas. So just to wrap up, I think breathing encompasses more than maintaining basic homeostasis in humans. So rather than thinking of it as a source of noise or something you might want to sort of regress out It's very important, obviously, for speech. It is the motor that runs speech, but also just coordinating socially, especially for turn-taking and things like that. Breathing has an interesting application with regards to interoception and self-regulation, cognition. But more recently, some people have started arguing that it could be something related to active sensing in humans. And again, there's a sort of evolutionary argument for why this might be the case that I'd be happy to explain further. Breath belts provide a simple, cheap, and accessible tool if you want to incorporate respiration into your experiment, but you really do have to be very careful during collection because they are vulnerable. And if you're interested in very precise timing, using simple thresholding or global statistics or signal analysis for your annotations may not be enough. So you might need something a little bit more involved if you'd like to do that. And that's it.